Hey Vinyl community, Jeff here, and I am back for another look at a top 10 great albums, sort of kind of ranked from a year, in this case 1985, that I own on vinyl at this point. Again, a brief explanation. These are only albums that I own on vinyl, so that means that I might have an album that I think is in the top 10, but don't currently own it on vinyl at all. So I'm not going to pull out CDs. So I'm limiting myself only because as I get through each year, it gets harder and harder. 1985 it was a lot harder than 84. 84 was a lot harder than 83 because these are the prime years. These are my late teen years, my late teen years, when I was really into music and metal and everything of the 80s. And so it's just, there's so many great bands. I had to kind of approach this year a little different because there were so many bands. I really kind of focused on bands with longevity in the sense that these albums I've played and returned to frequently. Maybe a little more frequently than others, but there are some other ones on the list. It was hard. This was hard. This is today's list as of today. What stood out to me as a top 10. I'm going to get right into it because I don't want this to be too terribly long. And this first one was really tough because there was really two of them vying for this 10th spot here. But I got Exciter, Long Live the Loud. Now, back in the day when this album came out, I was stationed in the military in Mississippi, and I came home for vacation, and two of my friends who went to the mall with me every week, payday, to get albums, they went over to Louisiana and saw Exciter on this tour. And I was so upset that I missed it because I was on vacation. But so it near and dear to my heart. I was really into Exciter on the album prior to this. I came in on Violence and Force. So they just became a staple in my collection and in my world. And then when this one came out, it was just, they just kept getting progressively a little more better produced and a little more just killer. And so, this album coming at number 10. The other one that really fought for that position was the first Exodus album. Bonded by Blood, I remember buying that in 85. And at that time, I thought it was probably the most brutal album I'd ever heard. And it was a little extreme for me, but I listened to it quite often. But I have to admit that if it came to Exciter over Exodus when it comes to listening, I'm reaching for Exciter usually rather than Bonded by Blood, at least at this time. So up for number 9, and they were on the EP list for the previous year, but Love You to Pieces by Lizzie Borden. I love the showmanship. I love the vocals, the music. Everything about this just screams straight up metal of the day, and the showmanship and the blood and everything. It reminded me of, the whole Wasp thing. They had come out the year before, and the stuff on stage and the blood and the imagery and just all the fun stuff, kind of like the pulling up the Alice Cooper days with all the theatrics and the stage blood and fun. So I just absolutely love the whole style of Lizzie Borden for these first couple albums. They're just to me solid, great stuff. And he's still around doing stuff periodically, and his newer music is just as great. So I really enjoy that stuff too. And then coming in at number 8 is one that is still a favorite band of mine. Almost everything he does. I love his voice. I love his style. And this album, while not his first album, kind of was his first major label debut. And so I'm pretty sure back in the day that I had this album before I got my hands on his first album, because it was on Shrapnel. And that's The Right to Rock by Keel, produced by Gene Simmons. I mean, this one just went off, and it was on MTV. So it really had everything behind it. And so everything just kind of came to fruition at this point. It just was like, this is the album that put him on the charts, even though there was, the album prior to this, which is an amazing album. And unfortunately, I don't have it on vinyl, or it probably might have made it to my last top 10 list. It's a great album, but still, The Right to Rock, I mean, it was a great album. I saw him on this tour, great tour with Keel, Helix, and Accept. Amazing time back in that days. Anyway, so yes, here we go at number 8, Keel, The Right to Rock. All right, now this one's going to come out of left field for a lot of you. You probably have no clue who this band is, even though I have shown it at numerous times in the past. But to this day, one of my go-to albums that I still listen to frequently. And I'm surprised this particular one has not ever been reissued on vinyl, whereas their first album, well, the one prior to this was, and a lot of their stuff has been reissued on CD, but never this one on vinyl. And that is 1985's, it's just entitled Vision. Now, you're going to be like, who is Vision? I mean, you know, whatever. This is, and you can't really tell from the picture, and I'm pretty sure it's this guy here, just looking at the eyes. After the whole plane crash thing with Lynyrd Skynyrd and the band, you know, broke up, the individual members went on to do different projects. Leon, the bass player, and Billy Powell, the keyboard player, joined Vision. It was a Florida-based band, and they did a album prior to this, and then this album just has Billy Powell on keyboards, and I should say piano, because he tears it up. This is just balls to the wall, amazing piano playing to the hilt. Gritty guitars, kind of bluesy, but still kind of, you know, just kind of a good rock. I don't want to use the term Southern rock. It's really not that. It's just everything about musicianship, the drummer, just the fills, everything about this album from start to finish is absolutely one of my favorites. But man, when Billy rips off on the piano parts, amazing. And there are keyboard parts in there too. But anyway, so I had to include this, even though it is a little more obscure. One of my all-time favorite releases from 1985. So Vision. Another one that might kind of be out of left field, because this would be also in the classification of Christian rock, and that's Leviticus, I Shall Conquer. The first album by this Swedish band, okay, the first album in English in America. They had a couple EPs and some stuff in their original Swedish language that came out, but this is one that came out in America, and I bought this in the independent release thing. It was on a small label, and I bought this in '85, and it absolutely was just, I mean, you know, it's not, people who are really steeped in metal stuff, it probably won't blow you away, but to me, at this time in my life, this album just was like a breath of fresh air. It's kind of a, you know, new wave of British heavy metal feel, kind of, but just everything about it. A lot of people kind of criticize the deep vocals on the singer on these first two albums, but to me, I love them. I love them, absolutely love them. And this album is near and dear to my heart. And so when I think 1985, when I think of the times of 1985 and the things I was going through and the life that I was living, this album was very pivotal in that time frame, and so it had to be included on my list. And in at number 5 is an album that has stuck with me for ever since it came out, for decades. For some reason, this album, and really this album only by this band, has just always maintained a high watermark on my in my musical mind, and that's King Cobra's first album, Ready to Strike. Now, this is Carmine Appice, and some of, you know, a lot of these people went on to do other things, and the band went on with and has had other, you know, singers in recent time. Paul Shortino did some albums with them, you know, I don't know, in the past 10 years. But this first album is just, in my opinion, unique. The second album, pretty radical change style-wise. The third, you know, and third albums and stuff, it just kind of went all over. But this album was just right in that sweet spot that I've enjoyed and always enjoy and still enjoy. And so when I think of this time frame, this album, seeing the video on MTV, just everything about the four blondes and the dark hair fella, you know, just amazing stuff. And of course, with Carmine being on this album, this is going to be right on the tails of him finishing the Ozzy Bark at the Moon. And so he was kind of a big thing in our life, because all of a sudden, here's Carmine. He's from the 60s and 70s, and Rod Stewart, and every band imaginable, Vanilla Fudge, all these different bands. But none of that made any sense to us. To us, he was the drummer that came in on Ozzy's Bark at the Moon. And then when he went to this, it was like we had to follow him to this. And it was absolutely just still one of my favorite albums. Great stuff. King Cobra's Ready to Strike. In at number 4 was a band, and we got to remember, this is the 80s, 85. We only knew about things in magazines. We didn't know a lot about this band. I knew nothing, little to nothing, but for some reason, something intrigued me about this. Not only the lyrics, The musical style wasn't traditional, like high speed, or uppity hair metal type feel. They had a plodding sound that wasn't doomy, but it just was kind of a mid-range. And for some reason, it greatly appealed to me, and it still greatly appeals to me. And that is Fighting for the Earth by Warrior. They've done a couple albums. I remember, so I bought this album. It was a one-off, and it was done, and that's all I really heard about them. And then years later, I forget what year it was. I'd have to look it up. 10, 15, seems like in the 90s. I go to a record store where they have all these used CDs, and I see an album, and it says Warrior on it, and I'm like, same band? Had an alien on the front. And then I think I flipped it over or opened it up, and it had that logo inside or somewhere on it, and I'm thinking, it is the same band. And I bought it. Absolutely killer album. I wish that would be out on vinyl. But pretty much the same lineup as far as the singing and everything. But then they've done some albums after that. They had Mark Storace sing on an album. They had Rob Rock sing on an album. Great stuff. But this one, amazing to me still. I love it. I know, just it's ingrained in my mind. The lyrics, the guitar parts is very spacey, very cool looking. And so this album has always, always, always been near and dear to my heart. And then in at number 3 is an album that I know people used to kind of make fun of only because of the accent. But to me, this one and the one or two that followed after that are the trifecta of almost perfection when it comes to musicianship and everything of that 80s sound. Thunder in the East by Loudness. MTV put them on the charts with Rock and Roll Crazy Nights. Now, they've got a handful of albums out in their native tongue in Japanese prior to this. There was one in English prior to this. But this was kind of like their American debut and of course that MTV wave brought them in. And they had the look, they had the sound. And, people want to make fun of the accent, Walk and Roll Crazy Nights. But I'm sorry. This album and Lightning Strikes and this whole time frame, these guys could do no wrong. It was just the guitar work, the drum work. Some of these guys are no longer with us, but and just the vocal and everything. And they have continued on for decades after this. And a lot of the musical styles have changed and stuff, but these first few albums in the early English days are absolutely amazing in my opinion. And in at number 2, and again, these ones in the 5 through 2 could probably swap around a little bit. It was really tough, but I put this one in the place where it is because not too terribly long ago, in the past maybe 3 years, I remember putting this album on and just thinking, my goodness, I forget how great this album is. So it always sticks in my mind that it just blew me away. And it still blows me away because it's just solid. It's just a solid album. And that's the first Rough Cut album. Paul Shortino, I mentioned him because he went on to sing some stuff on King Cobra in current years. He's done a lot of projects. Anything that he has his name on, I tend to try to scoop up and buy. Blue Dahlia was one I bought last year or so on CD. It was a fairly new thing that he's worked on. And I just follow most of the stuff that he's done. But this album, back in the day, it's still, to this day, absolutely one of my favorites. All the guys went on to do all kinds of other things, and there's been some other releases. And funny, that one of the CDs I showed last year, which was a Rough Cut reissue, was a couple of the guys from Rough Cut with the singer from Warrior. Tried to do some stuff. They did a demo, and that came out as a CD recently. But back when Paul left, or the band kind of split, a couple of these guys went on, and the singer from Warrior came over and they did an album. And it was just, it's just great to see the exchange of these things in these California bands. But I'm claiming for this one today at number 2, Rough Cut's first album, and they did a couple other great albums after this too. Love them. And then in at number 1, I'm sure some of you would probably say, I know where Jeff's going with number 1. It had to be number 1 on my list. 1985, pivotal year. I was there when this album came out. I was anxiously awaiting it. I bought the singles that were released before the album came out. Those little teasers they put out there with the 12 inches. And their first EP was so much blowing my mind that I could not wait to get my hands on Soldiers Under Command by Stryper. Absolutely absolutely played this to death in the day. Still absolutely love it. And it is just, the first album was great, had a little bit of rawness to it, had a little bit of, the mix was, it was a lower budget. I still to this day love that album. Hate the remix of the album, but I love the original, muddiness and all. Amazing young band, hungry, with amazing chops. And when they came to this, you get a little bit more money behind them, a little more clean, and you can really put out an entire album of great stuff. Now, yeah, it's squeaky clean. People can say, that's squeaky clean Christian music, and you got all these mellow stuff, First Love. First Love has probably been used at more weddings back in the day. People use that as a wedding song. But, you've got the big vocals, the dual guitar leads, you've got just the harmonies and everything here. And sure, in comparison to their stuff that they put out now, which is a lot, still got the harmonies, still got the dual leads, but is a lot more aggressive. This is kind of a little more squeaky clean. And it's the 80s, and that's what it was, and that's what we enjoyed. And at that time, this album was my favorite and still high up on my list. So 1985 is going to close out with Stryper's Soldiers Under Command. Check it out if you haven't. You only missed the boat by about 40 years. Anyway, so there you go. 10 great and there were, I made a list. You can't see this list. I wrote it on these erasable cards. Look at that's double column, front and back. There are so many that could have, I don't even want to rattle them all off because there's so many albums that 1985 was just blow my mind of the amount of albums that were out that were hard to choose from. But there you go. That's my list today. Top 10 great albums on vinyl in my collection as of now. Thanks a lot for watching. Rock on and rock hard.